Hey, sterile processing professionals and anyone else out there curious about sterile processing, Brandon the Sterile Guy here. For those of you who don't know, I have served in the sterile processing and operating room fields for over 20 years now, working at a variety of hospitals to include level 1 trauma centers, military hospitals, and even on a forward surgical team deployed to the front lines of Afghanistan. Needless to say, I've seen and done a few things. I have also been certified as a CRCST, which is the basic certification for sterile processing technicians, as well as instrument specialist and healthcare leader. I have also earned my certification as a certified surgical technologist, and lastly, certification in infection control. In today's video, we are going way back to school, a very abbreviated school, but back to Sterile Processing 101 to give you a brief but solid intro to the world of sterile processing. Quick interruption. If you want a much more in-depth training in sterile processing or want to be certain that you'll pass the sterile processing certification, you need to check out the Sterile Processing 101 certification prep course. This course contains over 6 hours of video lessons, has over 450 certification exam questions, and has a members-only community where you can study with other technicians. And it all comes with a 10-day money-back guarantee because I'm confident you'll love it. First link in the description or visit thesterileguy.com. Back to the show. This video is going to be a bit longer than my normal videos, so please use the restroom, make yourself comfy, grab some snacks, whatever you need to do to be present right here, right now. And before we jump into this adventure together, please hit that subscribe and like button to help get this video out there to more techs and prospective techs who are trying to enter this field or persons who just want to learn about sterile processing. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started. First off, what is a sterile processing department? Great question, glad you asked. First, let me say that not every place calls it sterile processing. There are many names like Central Sterile, Sterile Processing, and Central Material Supply, to name a few, but honestly, the name isn't important. I just want to keep you in the loop. For this video, I will refer to it as sterile processing. Sterile processing is a department in a hospital and some types of other facilities, which is the area where surgical instruments are cleaned and sterilized in between being used in surgical procedures. You didn't think we reused those nasty, bloody instruments without cleaning them first, did ya? Gosh, I hope not. So basically, for every area that uses reusable surgical instruments or procedural instrumentation, there's usually a sterile processing department or a place that is dedicated space for sterile processing to be done. If you think operating room, then think sterile processing. Think dental procedures, think sterile processing space. There's always an educated technician to perform the job of sterile processing whenever surgical instruments need cleaned and sterilized. And speaking of educated technician, let's segue into the heroes who work in sterile processing, known as sterile processing technicians. A sterile processing technician, or sterile tech for short, is an individual who works in many areas of sterile processing, completing many different jobs and tasks throughout an entire production process. And I purposefully use the word production because sterile processing is designed to work as a production line. And this is for good reason, which jumps us into the number one absolute core job of sterile processing and sterile processing technicians. It's the absolute heart of the job. Can you guess what it is? Infection prevention. Yes, I said infection prevention. Throughout everything a sterile tech does, everything comes down to stopping the spread of microorganisms that can cause harm to others. That is the job at its most simplistic form. Now, how that is translated into everyday operations looks a lot different depending on what types of instruments or equipment you're working with and which area of the sterile processing department you are working in for that day. So let's talk about sterile processing design for a second. Everything down to the flow, clothing, and even the air ducts are specifically designed to meet this overall goal of infection prevention. Let's start with the flow. Every sterile processing department works from dirty to clean. There are three main areas of a sterile processing known as decontamination, prep and pack, which is also known as assembly, and lastly, the sterile storage area. Some newer facilities have created a more organized layout in which they have a fourth major area, which is sterilization and cooling, but usually this area is embedded in the prep and pack area. Starting at the beginning of the flow, this is where instruments are received, and it is known as the decontamination room, which is sealed off and separate from the rest of the entire department. Now, if you work in a very small operation, then you may see a room that has segregated areas for the different jobs, but we'll talk more about that later. Dirty instruments come into the decontamination room where they undergo cleaning. Then they make their way to the clean side where they are inspected and packaged. Then those surgical instruments move to disinfection or sterilization, depending on their specific needs. And lastly, they move to an area known as sterile storage. This is the most secure area where instruments are kept protected until needed for the next procedure. So the flow moves in a pattern that goes from dirty to clean. Now let's talk about clothing. Sterile processing has three primary sections I spoke about: decontamination, prep and pack, and sterile storage. But there's also a risk level involved with the design. This is known as unrestricted, semi-restricted, and restricted. Depending on the risk level, these will determine the attire and personal protective equipment that you must be wearing in those designated areas. So unrestricted refers to outside the department in an area like break room or general hallways of the hospital. In these areas, you can be in street clothes and shoes that you wore right off the street. It's not a free ticket to be gross though. Wash your hands and please use sanitizer. Now, semi-restricted is the area inside of the general department where you must be wearing appropriate scrub attire, which also includes a hair cover as well as shoe covers that go over those dirty street shoes. Or you can do what a lot of technicians do and have a dedicated pair of shoes that stay in your locker when you are done for the day. That way you can change in and out of them without having to use those pesky shoe covers, because these dedicated shoes are not worn outside of the department. So these basic but critical standards reduce the amount of debris, contaminants, hair, and anything else that could enter the department. We definitely do not want those contaminants in there. And lastly, restricted level refers to the areas where procedures or surgeries actually occur, or a very biohazardous area. In these areas, you would be wearing a whole lot more protective attire over the items we already discussed. You'll find restricted level inside the operating rooms themselves, where surgery is in progress, as well as decontamination where it's very biohazardous. But for sterile processing in general, think semi-restricted. Okay, I hope you're still with me. Three physical areas of sterile processing: decontamination, prep and pack, and sterile storage. And then three risk levels, which determine the level of clothing and protective attire to be worn in each area depending on that area's risk level: unrestricted, semi-restricted, and restricted. These risk levels set the standards for what attire should look like by each area of the department. And lastly, about this whole design is the airflow and the air pressure. Air blows into the department in all sections and is HEPA filtered to prevent airborne microorganisms from spreading. But decontamination and other areas are completely different air channels. This is, of course, to prevent cross-contamination. Unlike on an airplane where someone in first class sneezes and you breathe it in coach due to the circulating air system. Sorry for that visual. I hope they regularly clean those cabin filters. So separate systems, but also separate amounts of air supplies and air returns. And what is meant by those definitions is there are vents that supply fresh air to the rooms, and then there are vents that return the air from the room. Just like your air conditioning at home, you have a supply vents that are in all the rooms that blow air in, but you usually have a return vent that is somewhere, usually in the middle of your home and maybe a main hallway, where the air is sucked out of the house and back into the air conditioning system. When a room receives the same amount of air that the return vents are pulling out, That is what we would call balanced air room. There's no pressure differential. Now, with the dirty area in decontamination, it works a little differently. In decontamination, more air is removed through the return vents than is actually supplied to the room from the air supply vents. What happens is, since the room doesn't have enough air to give to the return vent because the air supply is so stingy, the return vent creates this negative pressure as it pulls air from anywhere else it can. And this extra air mainly enters the room through the exposed area, usually from cracks around the doors to the room. So the concept and reason for this type of airflow is to ensure that all the airborne contaminants are sucked up into the return vents and become prisoners of the HEPA filter systems. Good riddance, you nasty bugs. This is a pretty cool concept to reduce airborne pathogens. If the room had balanced air, the pressure pushing the air out of the room would be a lot less, which would not get rid of very much of the airborne contaminants. Creating that negative pressure by supplying less air than you're actually removing from the room is much more drastic and much more effective. So that's negative air pressure in the dirty area. Now in the clean areas, it is the exact opposite. More air is supplied to the room and less air is pulled out of the room. This creates what is called a positive pressure situation. Instead of these areas sucking air from around the doors to the inside of the room like decontamination does, the clean area actually pushes more air out through those cracks to the rooms outside of the clean area. This is similar to when your house has unstable air pressure from your air conditioning or swamp cooler, and you go to close a door, and depending on which way the door opens or closes, you either have to push hard to get it to latch, or you barely touch it and it slams shut. And the main reason for this positive air pressure in the clean areas is that we want airborne bacteria and pathogens to stay away from our clean areas. So that constant air pressure pushes airborne microorganisms either into the HEPA filter return vents or out through the doors and the cracks around the doors. And you might ask, Brandon, wouldn't the negative air pressure force the airborne contaminants out of the room and into the HEPA filter vents anyways? It would, but it would also be pulling airborne contaminants from outside the room into the room. And that's the last thing we want in a clean area. If you're in the operating room and you're pulling air from outside the room inside, you're bringing a whole lot of contaminants that could affect that surgical site. That's why we want positive air to push it away. I hope that all makes sense. It's a really ingenious design and has contributed to countless lives that have been saved over the years by preventing so many infections. Even though it is just a utility in the background we hardly ever pay attention to, unless we are excessively hot or cold, it is an impeccable, wonderful design that keeps us safe. Now that we have talked all about infection prevention and how the Sterile Processing Department is designed to assist with that goal, let's jump into the day-to-day operations of a sterile processing technician. It all starts with the reception of soiled or unsterile instrumentation, which is received in the decontamination room. This could be instruments coming back from the operating room after surgery. This could be anesthesia blades needing cleaned and disinfected from the emergency department. And sometimes this is simply clean instruments from outside the hospital that are brought in because either they were purchased brand new or maybe they're being borrowed from another facility. Any reusable instruments coming into the department must go through the same process, starting with decontamination. The only exception is sterile instruments from your facility that are being returned because they weren't used for that procedure. Those are what we would call in the industry as returns. Those would bypass the decontamination area and come in through the clean doors. And we don't want to contaminate perfectly good instruments. That's why we bypass the decontamination area for those. Now that we are in decontamination, let's first go over safety. This area is by far the most dangerous in sterile processing, with risk of airborne pathogens, bloodborne pathogens, and many other different risks. Not to mention the machinery, high audible levels, heat, and the potential for slips and falls. You got to be present and aware of what is going on around you when you're in the decontamination area. This is also the area where you will wear the most amount of protective attire and equipment in the sterile processing department. Besides the scrubs, shoe covers, and hair covers we talked about earlier, you will add waterproof gowns, eye protection, masks, and heavy-duty gloves. For eye protection, I prefer to use the full face shields to prevent splashes. With all this protective equipment, you are ready to begin your duties in decontamination, which involves cleaning gross soil off of surgical and procedural instruments so that they can effectively be disinfected and sterilized for use. Instruments arrive to the department usually on what we call case carts or procedure carts. These should be carts on wheels that are mobile and can be enclosed and prevent fluid leakage while transporting. Instruments are generally supposed to arrive in your department fairly free of blood and bodily debris. However, that is going to vary significantly from facility to facility and case to case. Whether it is the time constraint or just poor practice in the operating room, you may receive instruments requiring extra attention. Those with aversion to blood, beware. With instruments that are contaminated with bloods, fats, proteins, and other debris, it is important to use the right chemicals and the right detergents, as well as the correct dosing and temperature in order to get the greatest action with removing soil. Sterile techs are great with these procedures, as sinks are filled to specific volumes with water that is in the proper temperature range, and then dosed with the correct ratio of detergents or enzymatics for cleaning. Enzymatics is a cleaning fluid of different enzymes that help to break down the different types of bodily fluids, making them loosen from the surgical instruments much easier. Surgical instruments are initially rinsed or soaked in water to loosen and remove the soil. They are then soaked in the enzymatic cleaning solution for a specific period of time before the actual cleaning begins with brushes and other cleaning supplies. To reduce air contamination, instruments must be brushed underneath the surface of the water. Once instruments are cleaned of all visible debris, they are rinsed of all remaining fluids and chemicals on the instruments. Now, most instruments will undergo the next step of ultrasonic cavitation cleaning, which is the exact same process that they use in a jewelry store to clean jewelry, but on a much larger scale. If you've ever had a ring cleaned, you may have heard that little buzzing machine they use. This machine creates specific sound frequencies or acoustics that cause millions of microscopic bubbles inside the water to implode, which works to loosen the soil off of the instruments. And the last step in decontamination is to use an automated cleaning machine that also disinfects the instruments, which makes them safe to handle for techs on the clean side. Now, a side note here, not all instruments can undergo this exact process. There are items like powered drills or flexible endoscopes that require a different form of cleaning that may require special cleaning supplies as well. And because of their design, may not be able to be submerged in fluid because it could destroy the electronic components of the item. Between decontamination and the clean side, the majority of sterile processing departments have what is called a pass-through window. Special items that cannot go through the automated washer will undergo their separate special cleaning and then be passed through the window. Also, the case carts that transport the instruments will also enter an automated cleaning machine that cleans and disinfects them as well, known as a cart washer. Now, back to the automated disinfection machines. They are designed to be a pass-through operation as well, meaning they are almost always part of the wall infrastructure that separates the sides of the department from dirty to clean. These machines are designed so that when one side of the machine is open, the other side is closed. Unless maybe a repair technician is working on them, it'll always work that way. This allows instruments to travel in that infection prevention flow while keeping a solid separation of areas. Once instruments reach the clean side after the cycle has run, they will need time to cool and dry since they will be dangerously hot after the thermal disinfection cycle. It is important to have heat-resistant gloves to handle instruments on the clean side right out of the machines because burn injuries are quite possible. Once instruments are cool and dry, they are ready to undergo our next section in the clean area called prep and pack. Here in Prep and Pack, there's a lot of steps that are taken to ensure instruments meet strict quality measures in order to move forward in the process. All instruments have different requirements, and you must refer to what is known as the Instructions for Use, or IFU for short. These are provided by the manufacturer for each and every instrument. An IFU is a manufacturer document which breaks down the proper and validated steps to handle, clean, disinfect, sterilize, and even store instrumentation. It also dictates the temperatures and times of steam sterilization cycle parameters, as well as low temperature cycle parameters, and any other type of sterilization or disinfection process. Now, the first and main task with Prep and Pack is instrument inspection. The inspecting process consists of critical components. Number one, you're inspecting for cleanliness. A phrase you may often hear in the field is, if it is not clean, then it cannot be sterilized. Debris or dried blood can actually become a barrier that prevents the sterilant from penetrating and killing the microorganisms underneath. Not to mention the debris, blood, or tissue material itself could enter a patient wound that may lead to infections and transmit diseases or even cause surgical wound complications. So visual inspection is critical. This is the part of the production process where you in sterile processing have one last chance to lay eyes on the instruments, making sure the cleaning process was effective at removing anything that can be seen with the naked eye. Most sterile processing departments also have lighted magnifying lenses to help in the process at a more detailed level. Number two, you are ensuring dryness. Instruments must be dry when entering the sterilization cycle. Leftover liquid can interfere with the sterilization process, causing cycle failures or even what we would call wet loads. That is a topic we will get to when we discuss sterilization. Next in the process is testing functionality. Are the hinges of the instruments working properly? Is all the screws secured if any are present? We are also testing sharpness for instruments like scissors. We are testing insulation integrity for laparoscopic instruments, and performing any other inspection necessary for the different types of instruments we are inspecting. Next is maintenance or lubrications, depending on the type of instrument and the manufacturer IFU. And lastly, the counting process for each instrument for each tray. Every tray has a specific list of instruments that belong in the tray, as well as a number of each type of instrument. A tray list might call for 4 Kelly clamps, and it is imperative that all 4 of those are present. Trays are designed to operate in specific surgical procedures, and lack of instruments could cause complications in the surgical cases if they are short the needed instruments. If instruments meet all specifications and are good to move on to the next step, then we move to packaging. There are several different options to package an instrument into an item that provides a barrier of protection for the instrument. Each one has 2 main jobs: to allow sterilant to penetrate and to reach the instruments during the sterilization process, and to protect the instruments after sterilization, making sure they remain sterile until they are opened in the operating room to be used. These different packaging items are containers, wraps, and peel pouches. Containers are generally made of metal and have disposable or reusable filters that prevent microorganisms from entering the tray, but allow the sterilizers to penetrate with the sterilant. The containers also provide the greatest protection from damage or contamination after sterilization, since they have a pretty hard shell exterior. This hard exterior is more forgiving with transportation and other tray movements. The wraps can be disposable, like the woven blue wraps, generally seen in the sterile processing department, or they can be reusable fabric as well. Both of these are folded in specific variations to protect the instruments, as well as create a perfect unpackaging sequence in the operating room. This protects the instruments from being contaminated while being opened by the operating room staff. And lastly, peel packs or pouches are generally used for single instruments or a small number of instruments that isn't enough to make a full tray. These are paper and plastic pouches that can either be heat sealed or they can be self-sealing. The paper side allows the sterilizer to penetrate to reach the instrument, and both the paper and plastic serve as the protective barrier for the instrument after sterilization. And something to note here, these packaging products are also covered by manufacturer IFUs, which dictate the type of sterilization and parameters they can endure. Now, a little pro tip here, with packaging materials and instruments both having their own IFUs, it is very important that you follow both IFUs. However, at no point can a packaging system IFU override the individual instrument IFU. So if a packaging IFU says it can undergo an abbreviated or short sterilization cycle, for instance, but the instrument IFU doesn't state that, then you stick with the instrument IFU sterilization parameters. All right, one more thing to talk about before we close and seal those packages. We need something that provides a form of communication to anyone who handles the tray to know whether it has been sterilized or not. A container full of surgical instruments is great, but if we don't know whether it was sterilized or not, then it's useless. This is where visual indicators come into play. Sterile processing uses a wide array of chemical indication devices to help staff immediately know whether instruments are safe to use or need to be sterilized. One of the main indicators seen more easily is indicator tape. If you've seen blue wrap trays with tape having black lines all over it, that means that tray is sterile and ready to use. That tape initially starts out as off-white colored tape having white stripes. Once that tape goes through a certain level of heat, the color changes to black or dark brown for steam, and other colors depending on the different types of sterilization. So for blue wrap trays, it's easy to identify if sterile or not. But what about containers? Sterilization containers will usually have multiple outside indicators, which can be found as dots on the filters or even dots on the locks or tamper-evident devices. These locks not only show whether a seal has been broken or not, but it also has that dot for easy reference of sterilization. Some people might think those different indicators are good enough to prove sterilization, but wait, hold on a sec. That only proved the outside of the tray came into contact with heat or a chemical sterilant. It doesn't show whether the steam or chemical sterilant made it inside of the tray to actually touch the instruments themselves. That is where internal indicators come into play. These are placed inside the trays in specific locations depending on the packaging, and they prove to the operating room staff once they open the tray that sterilant in fact penetrated down to the instrument level. But wait, there's more to say about chemical indicators. But let's transition to the next section called the sterilization area first. Because sterile processing is very serious work, we don't only want to know the sterilant made it inside the trays, we want to know if the certain parameters were met, such as temperature, concentration of the sterilant, and time. Sterilization mainly comes down to 4 key components between all the different types of sterilization. Those are time, temperature, pressure, and concentration. We need the right concentration of steam or chemicals. We need those at the right pressure inside the machines to contact the instruments. We need the temperature to be in the optimal range for either the chemical sterilant to work or for the steam to reach appropriate heat. And lastly, we need that optimal range of temperature, pressure, and sterilant concentration to be maintained for a specific amount of time. And that is why we mostly use chemical integrators inside trays, which are much more difficult tests, ensuring much greater confidence for those who use the instruments in the OR. Some integrators work kind of like a thermometer with the chemical in the strip. It takes a specific amount of heat to liquefy the chemical, and it takes a certain amount of time for that heat on the chemical to allow the staining up the strip to occur. Genius technology, really. And lastly, about verifying sterilization, we have taken it to the ultimate step, which is using biological challenge tests, mostly called bios. In a biological vial, there are millions of spore microorganisms that are highly resistant to heat and/or chemicals. And these are often put into the sterilization load with instruments to verify the killing power of the sterilizer. What better way to prove microorganisms are being killed than to actually do the process on really hard to kill live microorganisms? Sterilization has many other factors to consider, such as load weight, what is the density of all the instruments that are able to be sterilized in a single cycle. type of items being sterilized like metal, plastics, cannulated items, which all factor into the parameters and types of sterilization to be used. Some items have proven to take longer to sterilize than others and will have longer cycles. And lastly, load configuration, how the different types of packages are arranged on the sterilizer racks, considering spacing and cooling time. Metal trays and wrap trays tend to cool at different rates and could cause condensation, making trays unsterile once they are out of the sterilizer. This is something we would call a wet load, which is where liquid causes a strike-through. Let me explain both. A strike-through is when any part of a tray that is permeable comes into contact with liquid. The liquid in a filter or blue wrap serves as a passageway for microorganisms to enter the tray from the outside, which they normally couldn't if the tray was dry. And I might know what some of you are thinking. Brandon, if the tray is steam sterilized, isn't it wet already? Not exactly. Steam is water that reached a temperature so hot that it has become a gas. It is a wet gas, but a gas state nonetheless. Now, steam heated for sterilization is much hotter than your average boiling spaghetti noodles. Did you know that steam used in sterilization is 97% dry saturated steam? That means there's very little water in this high temperature steam, and it has very low humidity. It allows the steam to contact instruments in a wet gaseous state, causing the process that kills microorganisms without leaving moisture on the instruments. This isn't steam like pouring out spaghetti noodles into a colander. This is very dry steam with such intense heat, it will completely burn you without leaving moisture behind. It is a big misconception that steam sterilization loads are just full of water. And this brings me to a wet load. A wet load is when something went wrong in the cycle where moisture retained on the packaging leaves the packages wet and dripping moisture once they've been pulled out of the sterilizer. This could happen for many reasons, including sterilizer malfunctions, density of the sterilizer load that exceeded the IFUs, bad quality steam, and another major contributor is not drying instruments before sterilization. Just like the misconception that steam sterilizers are nothing but lots of hot water, many techs will leave instruments or trays wet, thinking that, well, the sterilizer uses water anyways, it will evaporate off. Remember, I said the steam used is 97% dry steam, so any water you add to the chamber affects that concentration, increasing your chances of failed or wet loads. Listen, sterile processing is a true science in every form. This is not an entry-level job anyone can do. It takes a lot of knowledge and skill to perform this job correctly. Okay, I think we have covered sterilization enough to have a decent idea of how that area works. Now let's move to our final staging area for our surgical instrument life cycles, the sterile storage area. Sterile storage should be the cleanest and least foot traffic area of your entire department. This is where all your sterile trays, instruments, packages, and sterile soft goods live. This is where everything stays protected until it is ready for use. And as I said a second ago, this area should have the least foot traffic, meaning only personnel who need to enter the sterile storage should be there. Any other access and movement is unnecessary traffic that increases the risk of contamination. Depending on the facility you're in, sterile storage can look wildly different. You could have stationary racks, rolling racks, wired shelving, flat shelving, drawers, Herman Miller cabinets, you name it. Regardless of the shelving and racks, all sterile items should be protected from moisture, sunlight, and dust. Now, when it comes to organizing all your trays, it is imperative you have the appropriate space to store your trays properly without compromising the packaging. And this includes how you stack trays. Every packaging system, whether disposable wraps or containers, have weight limits. They also may or may not allow stacking at all. This is a common mistake sterile processing departments make by stacking too many trays on top of the other due to limited space. Limited space is not a good excuse. You need to figure out your storage issues and request financial improvement through your chain of command. Sterile storage, besides being the living location of sterile items, is also the location in which cases are picked for the upcoming surgical procedures. Sterile techs will use what is known as preference cards or pick sheets, which are specific procedure needs. Often these are tailored to specific surgeons, so you're able to pick exactly what that surgeon needs for their specific surgical case. All items are stored in closable transport devices such as case carts and sent to the operating room to be used in a procedure. And once it is used, you guessed it, the process starts again at the decontamination room. Sterile processing is a very intricate and often well-oiled machine that completes a variety of complicated tasks that are essential to patient safety and patient life improvement. The job is fast-paced, detail-oriented, and highly rewarding, knowing that you are making a difference in so many lives. Unfortunately, this video, though it's longer than my normal videos, is way too short to cover sterile processing in depth. If any of the topics interested you and you want to dive further, check out my library of other videos on YouTube that go into greater detail over many different sterile processing subjects. If you're interested in becoming a sterile processing technician, click the first link in the description to get your online training started right away. You can become a sterile processing tech in as little as 4 months. And lastly, if you are already a sterile processing technician, but you're not certified, check out thesterileguy.com to get practice tests and flashcards that help prepare you for the certification exam. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing and give the video a like. Any topics or videos you want to see, leave those in the comments down below. Thanks for watching the video. I love you guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.